In medtech, the difference between a good quarter and a great one isn't always the product. It's the friction standing in the way. Broken sales cycles, misaligned teams, deals that stall at the finish line. Every leader feels it, and the best ones know how to remove it. Welcome to Zero Friction, the podcast where we go inside the minds of medtech's top commercial leaders to uncover the real barriers they face, the decisions they make, and the systems they build to keep the revenue moving. I'm your host, Terry Kuchaluchis. Let's remove some friction. Welcome to the Zero Friction Podcast. This is Terry Kuchaluchis, and I have another exciting guest today, Josh Garrison, who is the co-founder of Village Health. And Village Health in its current state is an EMR platform that's doing its own purpose of changing healthcare. But more importantly, it's setting up for a bigger transformation on how urgent care may be delivered in the future. So Josh, if you could, just give us a little background on yourself and then take us up to speed where Village Health is today.
Yeah. Hey, Terry. It's a pleasure to be here. So, my name is Josh Garrison, and I've spent kind of the last 10 years working in big tech, kind of at the intersection between tech and operations. And really growing up with a lot of family, parents, and aunts and uncles in the healthcare space. And also, as a consumer myself, I kind of started to view healthcare as an area where there's a lot of addressable, and, we could start to rethink how to improve the patient experience. And so this was kind of an interest of mine personally. And then when COVID came about, I think that was a really good at scale stress test saying, hey, this system doesn't work. We had SLAs from a wait time perspective going in the wrong direction. We had basically outcomes going in the wrong direction. And there was a couple of mindset shifts that I started to really get interested in and reading about and observing that I felt was kind of lacking in healthcare. And kind of that first mindset shift was overall, healthcare is kind of lacking a bit in consumerism. I think Walt Disney said it best, when he said, hey, when you look at, healthcare today, you just don't see a lot of consumerism and really just kind of another mindset, is patience is customers. So with these two mindsets in place, we initially started building our EMR, which is a boutique EMR, really looks to put a large language model where we think it makes sense for providers to really help claw back on the provider to administration or administration ratio. If we take a look at the provider to administration ratio, you've seen provider growth from the 70s, really stay flat. But, you've seen administration growth grow a lot, 3,500%, right? So there's a lot of money being spent there. I think some of that is structural. Some of that is being driven by poor EMR experiences. So we built an EMR that, really just allows users, really for kind of all practices to take the patients through a traditional patient journey, whether it's a one-off appointment or more recurring rehabilitative care where SMART goals and SOAP notes need to be administered. Providers can do all that in our platform at a very low cost and kind of have all their insurance prepped, but also have good visibility of what outcomes are looking like across their practice. And really, this is kind of our first step in building something larger where ultimately kind of going back into that, lack of healthcare consumerism. We believe that kind of the ideal patient experience is for a lot of illnesses, why not just have the doctor kind of show up in your home? So as we kind of scale and launch the EMR, we're pivoting into kind of building out a provider network that from the comfort of your own home really allows patients to say, hey, I'm not feeling good. I would like to have someone come out and take a look. And if we find that we need to do some treatment that we would traditionally execute kind of in the ER or through admission, we're actually going to try and administer at home and try and circumvent that whole admission process.
That's a really interesting concept. And, in today's society, with Uber and DoorDash and Amazon, who you work for as well, right? Like we live in a push button society where no matter what we need, it's never further than our phone, right? Or our laptop or our desktop or whatever that might be. And so why should healthcare be any different? Like, so especially if we can
Absolutely.
do it more affordably, more efficiently, create great experiences and provide good care, and along the way, find a way to reduce the cost of healthcare instead of going to an urgent care center and spending three or four or $500 out of pocket for, one ailment or another and a shot or something, like, you can have a virtual visit, you can have it triaged at a lower cost, faster efficiency, and then find a way if you do need a higher level of care, right? And we can talk about what that level of care looks like and how Village Health has identified that nice sweet spot category where you feel like you can make a real impact. To me, that's phenomenal. Like you have virtual telehealth for primary care. The urgent care business across America is exploding, and now you're bringing something that can totally continue that transformation, not only further away from the hospital to urgent care, but now you can get urgent care delivered at home, which is what a remarkable concept.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you really kind of, hit it on the head with, just kind of some of the cost allocations not really kind of, working out for patients, and there just being an opportunity to, if we reset the table and rethought about kind of how we treated the patient without any kind of advances in, you know, scientific studies, or medical treatments, we think we can deliver a lot of savings for customers. Because when you look at, an ER admission, 25% of your bill, out the door is administrative spend. That's 15% for primary care. And then, when you're in inpatient, you get a little bit of, cost spreading that's down to 8%. But we really think that, you know, going to the patient will actually, be able to help us deliver a cheaper cost. And at the same time, there's a lot of hospital at home studies out there through PubMed. And what they did is they kind of had two treatment groups, or they had a treatment group and a control group where, one group was treated at home and the other group was treated in the traditional system. And we found that in the group that was treated at home, they were able to reduce average costs by about 38. And so, imagine if your doctor, showed up at your house, you were able to circumvent kind of the traditional ER admission and overall kind of process, and your bill was 38% cheaper, and you have kind of the experience of doing it at your house. That's kind of the overall service model that we're leaning into.
And, there's other evolutionary demographics that are changing too. So insurance becomes more expensive. Families are opting for lower premium, higher deductible policies, right? You go to an urgent care center with an insurance plan and it's three, four, $500. Like it's not a small amount of money. I have my own personal family experiences with my kids, and they think they're young and they don't need to have a robust health plan, so they go for the cheap one. And you got to go to urgent care, and it was like $500, like
Yeah.
walk in and walk out of there. And so, like, there has to be better options for us because paying out of pocket basically when you have a $7,000 deductible, you're going to be paying out of pocket all year long if you're relatively healthy. And every time you go for a cold or you know sinuses or whatever it might be, you drop in three, four, $500. That's like real money, and it's beyond real money. It's big money, and so doing what you're doing, quickly, efficiently, cost effectively, triaging the care. You can always go get higher levels of care if you need it, but being able to manage that is, a remarkable opportunity.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned, there has to be better options. And I think kind of an interesting gauge of kind of where we're at, is the healthcare system is, if you look at net promoter scores, right? So, hey, how often are, the customers I interact with, promoting the experiences I deliver? Like healthcare in the aggregate is in the low teens, and, more consumer centric companies like Apple, they're in the 80s, right? So that's kind of, I think the customers, in the aggregate, in the NPS scores are telling us that. And if you look at life expectancy versus health spending, I think this also kind of aligns with that NPS, right? We've been a clear laggard in the United States for quite some time. Like to me, this is, just unfortunately, I think failure at scale. The good news is, we're starting to go high and to the right on life expectancy, right? But it's
Yep.
coming at the cost of expenditure. So um, we've got to solve that.
Think you've got another chart for us, which really kind of outlines maybe some of the implications of our value-based care system today. I think we had talked a little bit about there's some really interesting data regarding physician and administrator growth.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is where we really believe is kind of the root cause of what's driving our healthcare expenditures versus outcomes in the wrong direction. Really, this study is kind of going back, and this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but really going back from 1970s is the baseline. You've seen about 3,200% growth in administrator headcount versus only about, 100%, 150% growth in physician headcount.
Wow.
And yeah,
What happened
so
there
we
in the middle? Like something like been some sort of dynamic change there in like 1990-ish or so.
yeah, and so this was managed care and insurance reimbursement,
Okay.
complexity going a lot higher.
Wow.
And I think the reason why NPS is going in the wrong direction is because the hospital system is burdened with having to have all these administrators, right? Um, when you look at the traditional, kind of hospital system, their monthly bill or their monthly expenditures, about 35 to 40% is not even touching the patient. Um, right. So when you have that amount of monthly misallocation, and then you get slammed in backlog, right? Which, is our COVID scenario. Um, you're gonna, have SLAs going the wrong direction. You're not going to be able to treat patients. So I think if we as a healthcare society kind of focused on bringing this down and bringing this up, we would be in a much better spot with those NPS scores.
For sure. And, the cost of care would be a lot more efficient. I think our healthcare system would run more efficiently too. Like, you have that much cost associated with your deliverables. It'd be hard to believe any business could be viable at that kind of rate.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a really compelling chart. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. So tell me what's next then. So, where do you go next with this platform? It's so interesting. It's so compelling, by the way. Like where do you and your co-founder, it's Raj, right? Raj is the technical guy. Where do you guys
Yeah,
see this going next?
yeah, absolutely. So we are definitely from a next steps perspective, now that we have kind of the EMR in place and a solution where, providers can go in and, really just execute the care and have a virtual experience that supports them. We really want to lean into growing the health at home. We really want to start looking at growing the health at home infrastructure and kind of taking a metro by metro approach. So we're very interested in any state where, there's kind of strong Medicare, Medicaid, managed care programs. We're very interested in Arizona, Texas, Florida, and Georgia. And we believe, this model will work anywhere where those programs are in place. And there's kind of been a lot of debate about, if these changes to Medicare and Medicaid, are going to be a positive thing for the healthcare industry. I view it as kind of our proving ground because if you look at, that the legislation, they're getting more strict on what gets reimbursed. And you know, looking at kind of the data, that we just looked at with growth and physicians and administrators, a lot of the cost that is being, passed on to patients isn't treatment, right? We're just passing indirect spend to the patient. So I'm actually excited about a more Medicaid or a more strict reimbursement regime. And so our thought process is over the next 6 months, we really want to find a chief medical officer co-founder who's really mission aligned and can kind of help us start scaling metro by metro, and really kind of what alignment looks like for me in a CMO is someone who's not only a clinician, but is an operator at heart, and, who's really interested in kind of, resetting the table, so to speak, and how we deliver, healthcare to customers.
That's awesome. And, not only being a great operator is a big part of it, having a great network. And that's a big role for you guys. Will be a big strategic component of, how you deliver care, where you deliver care. I'm looking forward to going through that process. That's exciting. So what do you need to do in order to get this thing moving and off? Like, where's your friction points right now, Josh, when you think about like what's next for Village?
Yeah, so from a friction point perspective, I would again say circling back to getting that CM, and then also, still kind of debating from an operational perspective if we want to be more of a monolith where, we, hire all of the doctors, they work on kind of our payroll, along with PAs, nurses, lab technicians, or if we kind of want to go a more contractor approach. I think there's pros and cons to both. With the monolith approach, you get a lot more controls kind of on standards, right? But scaling can be slower. Whereas if we start partnering with other providers who have a little bit more capacity than we have today, but they might meet our standards, there may be some benefits in partnering them today, kind of before we have all of our infrastructure built out. So those are kind of the friction points that are keeping me up at night.
Gotcha. And so how do you view the different levels of care? Is it going to be like three levels of care theoretically? Like, is there a virtual telehealth option in your model, or is it just a go-to home model and then triage to the facility?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, from a customer journey perspective, we really want to start with, the customer says they're sick via the app, and, we can do a telehealth, evaluation right there. But, we really want to kind of target our niche is really kind of folks that are, what's called a SEP 3, through 5 admission. These are kind of things like, cellulitis, pneumonia, certain diabetic care regimens, things that today you need to go to the hospital for, but, you're not a mortality risk, right? You only have to go to the hospital because unfortunately that's where the only resources are to get that care. So kind of from our patient journey perspective is, once we've kind of done that virtual triage or the patient, has said, hey, I just would really like you to come out, get eyes on, what we're going to do is, we're going to evaluate the patient at home, kind of start all that, IV treatment, labs, planned, any nurse regimens, set up remote monitoring, really just kind of establishing what that regimen is and bringing in any equipment needed. And then kind of, as the patient recovers, we're checking in on them from a virtual perspective, but we also have physical rounds scheduled, so we're always getting that physical kind of check in and touch point. And then as the patient is recovered, that's kind of our tear down process where we go in, kind of get all the equipment, handle kind of discharge instructions with the patient, and then handle all the billing on the side.
Well, good. And so from all your SaaS lessons with the EMR and moving forward, like, so getting the CMO in place, are you looking for funding? Are you funded? Are you bootstrapping? What does the funding? Because I'm guessing, like scaling this thing is not, inexpensive.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So we're definitely interested in funding and engaging venture, for kind of building out, this kind of health at home model. A lot of the lessons learned, from the SaaS perspective, would be, I think the first big one is I should have just kind of built the big thing first. I kind of took hey, let's, use the EMR to fund, the bigger CapEx heavy idea. And
Right.
I did this in the middle of a software re-rating where, because of, agentic frameworks, AI, a lot of people in the market, kind of think software eventually may be a commodity, right? And instead of a moat. So just going after the big thing is really important. Other lessons learned in the SaaS space are be very careful about where in your software architecture, where you invoke AI. I think there is tons of over engineering within high level designs where, throughout your workflow, you're just calling the LLM a lot and you're going to blow out your token budget. A lot of the
Sure.
big players are seeing this, with non-medical, challenges. Token budgeting is really important. So if you're thinking about using AI in your EMR rather than in your customer workflow invoking the LLM, maybe just use the LLM to build a really solid heuristic model, right? That, can ping a billing API, right? Or can write a report, something that can live, on a server or in the cloud. Have
Right.
the AI create that, but don't invoke the LL every transaction in your workflow. I think that that's really big. And other lessons I would kind of like give to founders is, as we continue to operate kind of in this agentic, potential commodification of software is, don't be afraid to put an MCP around your EMR, and that way you can start integrating with other,
Platforms.
EMRs. MCP is machine context protocol. That's kind of the standard language, that, Terry, if I wanted my, EMR to interact with your revenue system, they would kind of talk to each other that way. So having a plan to kind of MCP your whole software stack is something I would also say is a big lesson learned.
Yeah, something like probably how like Clay kind of works, how they do that aggregation model, and how you can have 12 or 15 different platforms that operate within Clay pretty autonomously, which is nice too. So, um, yeah, I agree with you. The MCP is an important layer for any platform today for agents to work together and communicate and engage. So, any other last closing statements on the Village Health piece? I have one more question for you before we go, but I want to make sure is there anything else left on Village Health? We can tackle it now.
No, just, my parting words, for the viewers is, for all of us that are working on, like cool innovations and projects, just really keeping there in mind that, patients are ultimately, customers, and thinking through, how can we get that NPS, those NPS scores in the right directions? How can we get, healthcare outcomes versus expenditures going in the right directions? I think if everybody just keeps those in the back of their minds and applies it to what they're working on, we'll be in a really cool spot in the future.
I totally agree. Couldn't be better said. You nailed it right on the head. At the end of the day, patients are our consumers of healthcare, and just like anything else that we're buying in today's society of 5 Google star ratings and customer experience and all those things are important. And I think the more that healthcare providers and platforms of healthcare realize that it is real money, it's not insurance money, it's real people's money now, that we've got to put those things in front, like value for care, like it should be equivalent. And it seems sometimes it's not always there. So thank you for that. So
Okay.
Josh, I have one final question for all my guests, or at least when I remember, is that I love asking this question where current day Josh had the opportunity to go back and meet 22-year-old Josh. What would be the only one, if you had one piece of advice to give, what advice would you provide?
It would have been to lean into healthcare earlier. At that time, that was around 2016. So prior to COVID, there was all this technology out that, could have enabled care at home. I don't think we need AI to deliver care at home. you could pause all AI and therapeutic innovation and still deliver all of this, today, just with the innovations we have. So it would have probably been to
Gotcha. Well, that's great advice, and what a great purpose and what a great mission. So Josh, it's been great having you today. Thank you so much for being here. We wish you and Raj and Village Health nothing but great success.
yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Terry. It was an honor to be here.
That's a wrap on Zero Friction, the show built around one simple idea: remove the barriers and the revenue will follow. If today's conversation was valuable, please subscribe and share it with somebody who needs to hear it. That's how we will grow this community. I'm Terry Kuchaluchis, revenue architect powered by AI. Come find me at my website, myrevrx.com, and let's talk about what friction is costing you and your organization. Until next time, keep removing the barriers and keep the revenue flowing.